Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror and detail, the realm where the shadows whisper ancient secrets and nightmares come to life. I am your guide through the darkness, and on this channel, we delve into the spine-chilling world of Wendigo horror stories that will send shivers down your spine. First story, Hunted by a Wendigo. I realize how unbelievable this story might be, but I assure you it's entirely true. I've had countless experiences with the supernatural since I was 4. I'm 33 now, but this is one of the most terrifying ones I've had. I've looked at some of the stories in this community to see if there's anything I haven't discovered yet. I thought that if I shared my encounter here, there might be someone who has some information that could help. Please don't comment if you don't believe in the supernatural. I've seen skeptics plastering their 2 cents on some posts. I'm looking for legitimate information. My questions are at the end of this. Thanks in advance. I had an experience with a Wendigo this fall in early October in northern Minnesota in a state forest, very close to, if not on, a reservation. I've always heard that speaking of them can draw them to you, but I hadn't thought of or listened to any Wendigo stories any time close to my encounter. I was staying with some very dear friends. I'll call them M and C, and they have a camper in their yard by the lake for guests to sleep in. I had walked down to the camper from the house with my miniature dachshund, Ebony, around midnight and found that I needed to set some things up, primarily the heater. By the time I was done getting everything in order, it was approximately 1:30. I never thought to lock the door because, really, I figured it's in the middle of the woods, so there was nothing to worry about. I was wrong. I had closed the curtains, thank God, and I was having trouble falling asleep because my anxiety was going mad. M and C's dogs were barking outside, and their geese wouldn't stop honking. Ebony, who usually sleeps under the covers, was sitting on my hip while I laid on my side, and I could feel her turning her head back and forth, like she was trying to track something outside. I tried tucking her under the blankets to calm her down, but she kept returning to her perch on my hip. I have no idea how long I laid there. I would say at least 40 minutes, when all of a sudden I heard M's voice outside the camper. "Anybody in there?" And what sounded like claws dragged down the side of the camper. I almost called back to her when I realized, number one, she and C were both fast asleep by now, and number two, M knew I was in there. She wouldn't ask if anybody was. Suddenly, I noticed everything had gone absolutely silent outside. The dogs and the birds had stopped carrying on. The gusts of wind had even stopped. It was the kind of silence you hear about in horror stories. How the woods go mute when something evil is in the area. Then another thought hit me. Ebony would be losing her sh*t and barking at the door if that had been anything human. She was frozen on my hip, dead quiet, shaking. I didn't dare to move, but I was really starting to have to pee. And I remembered that I hadn't locked the door. I have no idea how long I laid there debating whether I should get up and use the bathroom and lock the door, but it felt like an eternity. In reality, I guess it was maybe 10 to 15 minutes. I thought it may have been a skinwalker at first, but remembered they don't mimic the voices of your loved ones to lure you into the woods. Wendigo do. I knew these creatures, demons, whatever they are, can lure humans out of their abodes if they make eye contact with you, and everything in me was screaming to make sure I didn't look outside. I made doubly sure I didn't look through any cracks in the curtains as I walked softly to the front of the camper and very slowly turned the lock, praying and holding my breath. I made sure to keep my eyes away from the windows as I crawled back in bed and pulled Ebony close, and she finally stayed under the blankets. I snuck a peek at my phone for the time before I laid down, figuring it had to be close to 3 a.m., the witching hour. It was about 2:30. As soon as I laid down, the wind kicked back up and M and C's basset hounds erupted into howls as they came running down to the camper and a little ways into the trees. and the geese started their noise again. I heard the Bassets come back to the camper, barking a few more times before they laid down outside the door to protect me. I didn't get out of bed again that night. I told Em and see what had happened the next morning. I think I was hoping Em would say she had come down to check on me and Ebony, but she confirmed what I already knew. They had gone to bed as soon as I had left the house. I said a prayer over their house, the camper, and all of us the following night, and had an uneventful night. Thank God. I also spoke with another guy who's familiar with the supernatural to see if he knew any more about Wendigo Act. I'm not sure how accurate the information he gave me was, or if it's reliable at all, but when I asked him why Ebony hadn't made a peep, I had assumed it was because she was absolutely petrified. He said a Wendigo can control animals to keep them from alerting their owners about its presence. He also told me one. They can't enter houses that aren't made of wood directly from the forest they're hunting in, tents and campers included, because they consist of man-made materials. 2. A lock is useless. They can unlock and open a door so they can try to lure you outside. And 3. They typically stay in the woods, but they will come into a smaller town and never into a city. I had never heard of any of what he told me before. So again, I can't speak for accuracy, but I also haven't researched the claims either. He also advised me never to go outside to pee at night if I ever go camping, and to bring a bucket or something to use, and to make sure that I always close tent flaps and curtains before falling asleep. He said if the flaps are open so you can see outside, the Wendigo can make eye contact with you and draw you out. After leaving M and C's to go to my father's house for a few days, I had the distinct feeling of being watched when I took Ebony outside after dark. My father lives 3 hours away from M and C, but his house is in the country. I told myself it was only the fear from the experience and what I know about the Wendigo triggering an overactive imagination. I never heard anything, and I watched Ebony's behavior very closely, and she didn't act like she had in the camper. I'm moving back to that area from Canada, and this experience has been weighing heavily on my mind. I've been trying to find any information about warding them off, or if they have a home hunting range like cougars do, or if they move on from a region. My prayers did work the second night, so I figure I can pray over the property. I also have holy water that I can use, since the Wendigo is an evil spirit that possesses people or physically manifests. Frustratingly, a majority of what comes up in searches is utter garbage like Wikipedia. Does anyone know if a Wendigo stays in one area? Are my concerns about it coming back when I get moved into my cabin warranted? Or am I worrying excessively? Second story. My childhood dog ran into the woods. When he returned, there was something very wrong with him. I vividly remember the day Duke disappeared. My family was spending the day at the lake next to our little bungalow at a quaint property in northern Ontario. All 4 of us were swimming and splashing around in the warm lake water, attempting to quell the blistering August heat. Our only neighbor for miles, an old retired police officer named Benny, was smoking on his patio. I waved to him, and he waved back. We were in the dog days of summer, and I was glad to be in the water. Duke loved the water as much as I did, and was still very energetic, being a large, middle-aged mutt. We would often throw frisbees and sticks off the dock, where he would take flying leaps into the blue-green lake. That's exactly what we were doing when he vanished. As I was drawing back my hand to throw the frisbee for Duke, who was anticipating a throw and getting ready to run, he suddenly whipped his head to the woods. I too looked back at the rows of towering hardwoods and conifers, scanning them to see what Duke was looking at. It was nothing, at least to me. What followed was a blur. Duke suddenly bolted for the trees, barking and snarling all while we were screaming his name. I screamed at my parents to get out of the water and help me chase him. I even saw Benny spring out of his rocking chair to help us. I ran as fast as my 9-year-old legs could carry me into the dense forest, twigs and debris snapping under my feet. But you can only get so far in flip-flops before you trip. I tumbled to the ground screaming and crying after accidentally scraping my leg against a sharp rock. My mom consoled me, while I caught a glimpse of my dad running through the woods. It was a while before my dad and Benny came back. My dad had a somber look on his face. He didn't have to tell us what we already knew. But Benny looked shaken. I am sorry, folks, but he ain't coming back," he said shakily. He took off his faded baseball cap respectfully and patted me on the shoulder before trudging up the hill back to his house. My whole family missed him, but to me it felt like a part of me left when Duke did. He had been my best friend since I was young, and I even had a small photo album packed with pictures of the two of us. For a while, every night before bed, I would sift through the laminated pages of the photo album, reminiscing about good times and praying that someday he would come back to us. Deep down, I knew he wouldn't. A few months after Duke disappeared, my dad arrived home from work with a surprise. It was another dog. It wasn't elegant and athletic like Duke was. It was one of those tiny, white yappy ones with crusty red goop around its eyes. My parents fell in love with it. Princess, they called her. But I didn't. I simply referred to her as the dog. I was bitter, so bitter because I'd interpreted my dad's gesture of kindness as his own confirmation of Duke's absence. In time, I did grow to tolerate her. I had to admit, she was good company, and it was cute when she curled up by my feet. Life was going normally for us until Duke came back. It had almost been a year since Duke had disappeared. On this particular day, we were all cooped up inside, courtesy of the rain. I was engulfed in my book when suddenly I heard a bark. Not a high-pitched yap, but a deep, booming bark. I put down my book and rushed to the back door where I had heard it, Princess scuttling at my heels. When I peeked through the window, I nearly fell over. It was Duke. Somehow. By this time, my parents had arrived. My mom rushed past me and whirled the door open, while my dad and I hung back, mouths agape. As my mom hugged Duke, I couldn't help but notice something off. I'd spent countless hours spending time with him and sleepless nights poring over photo albums. I'd familiarized myself with every spot, marking, and quirk of Duke's fur. One of his most striking features was a black spot over his left eye which had appeared in almost every one of the photos. But standing here was Duke, his eye spot was now on his right eye. As a matter of fact, his whole pelt seemed to have been flipped. He was missing his collar, and he was skinnier than we'd last seen him, but it was him all right. Well, that's what I'd thought. The first red flag was how Princess reacted to Duke. She was a yappy dog, all right, but when she saw Duke, she went ballistic, spitting and yapping like we'd never seen before. Princess barks at everything, remember? My dad told me, sensing my discomfort. She's probably just barking because he smells like the forest. And with that, he went outside to greet Duke. The barking must have alerted Benny, and he went outside to see what the commotion was. Once he saw what was going on, he darted back into his house and audibly slammed the door. When my parents came back inside, I tentatively stuck out a hand for Duke to sniff. He didn't wag his tail like I expected him to. All he did was quietly sit down. Then he heard Princess yapping from the other side of the room. His head swiveled and he lifted himself and padded confidently towards her. Before long, he had her cornered. All he was doing was standing and watching her. Yet Princess' eyes were bulging as she howled and yapped. A sense of dread was beginning to creep up my spine. But before anything happened, my dad whistled and Duke lifted his head. With one last glance at Princess, he slunk away. The sense of wrongness didn't alleviate for the rest of the time Duke was with us. The second red flag was that Duke didn't eat the food we put out for him. Granted, it was food intended for small dogs, but it was still the same formula. Dogs are wired to eat everything they can get their paws on anyways, so even then it wouldn't have mattered. Not once did I see him eat. Every time we let him outside in the woods to relieve himself, he came back 20 minutes later, his white muzzle stained pink. I found it odd that my parents didn't think he was at risk of running away again, but since he didn't run, I never brought it up. They spent all their time with Duke, petting him, coddling him, attempting to feed him, and playing with him. All this while completely ignoring Princess, as well as my objections. Something's different about him, I brought up during dinner one day. That's nonsense. What are you talking about? Said my dad. He's good, OL, Duke. He looked at the dog as if searching for approval. We ate the rest of dinner in silence. As the summer went on, Duke seemed to gain more and more influence over my family. At this point, it was just me taking care of Princess. It was up to me to feed, walk, and take care of her now, as my parents had completely neglected her. This dog wasn't the Duke I used to know. Every time he walked into the same room that Princess was in, she would scuttle away in fear and into my arms. I took to always being in the same room as Princess, just as a precaution. From what I didn't want to admit, but deep down I think I knew. One day, Benny approached me while I was walking Princess. "You doing okay, kid?" I trailed off. Benny bent down to meet my height, his friendly blue eyes clouded with concern. "Be careful, kid. If you need any help, I'm right up here." Without another word, he turned and walked back into his house. When I came back from the walk, my mom announced that we were going to the store. Dad had figured out that Duke liked raw meat, and we had run out of it. As a matter of fact, we had run out of all other food in the house. But of course, in order to enter the grocery store, we needed to leave the dogs alone. I wanted to stay home and look after Princess, but my mom wasn't having it. "I don't know why you always insist on being around that dog," said my mom. "It's not healthy." "Look who's talking," I muttered. "We're going to buy a bunch of raw meat for a dumb dog." For that, she slapped me. Tears sprung from my eyes. "Don't you dare speak about Duke that way," she huffed. "Get in the car." Without another word, I did as she said and got in, leaving Princess behind with the dog. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. I couldn't stop thinking about Princess as my parents cleared out the raw meat section. The drive home was nerve-wracking, and the walk up the driveway to our cottage was dreadful. I could hear the whimpering even before the door was open. Hard in my throat, I whirled the door open and screamed. Princess was under the kitchen table, leg bleeding profusely. No, it was gone. One of her legs was just gone. Curled up on the carpet was Duke, muzzle stained red. The rest of my family walked in. "Oh, the mess you've made. Bad dog," my mom said as she scolded Princess. She gave a pathetic whimper in response. This was my breaking point. "Stop," I wailed. "Are you guys blind? He tried to kill her. She needs to go to the vet." Yeah. "Duke, I have a snack for you." His ears shot up as my dad ripped open a package of ground beef. My stomach growled. I hadn't eaten all day, and the only food we'd bought was meat for Duke. I was livid. This damn dog was taking them over. I didn't feel safe anymore. "I'm leaving," I announced. "I'm taking Princess with me." Tears were streaming down my face, even as no one acknowledged me. I packed a few belongings and grabbed a towel to wrap Princess in. I remembered what Benny had said to me earlier that day, and I knew what I had to do. As I trudged down the dirt trail to Benny's house, thoughts collided into each other in my mind. Why were my parents ignoring me so much? Why didn't they care about Princess? Did they even love me anymore? The last one made me cry even harder. I reached the faded red door of Benny's house and knocked. He appeared a moment later, and when he saw me holding Princess with tears streaming down my face, his breath hitched. I knew this would happen. He muttered gravely under his breath. "Get in my truck, kid. We'll go get your dog some help." He unlocked his truck, and without another word, and I climbed silently into the back seat. I watched the cloud-dotted sky turn into pale shades of pink and purple as we sped down the bumpy road. After a while, we arrived at a small house, which seemed to have been converted into a veterinarian clinic. Benny took Princess in his arms and rushed in, yelling for help. I followed along slowly and sat down in the waiting room, sad and defeated but too tired to cry even more. After a lot of frantic pleading, Princess was to receive emergency care. A woman in a teal veterinarian's uniform carried her away. I sprung out of my seat. "Let me go with her," I begged. Benny guided me away. "She's going to get help now, kid. It's in God's hands now." I plopped back down and curled into a ball. Benny patted me on the back. A somber silence had appeared between us, when I broke it by asking Benny something that I hadn't gotten the chance to before. "Benny, MHM, what did you mean when you said that you knew this would happen?" He tensed up. A guarded look crossed his face, then one of guilt. He exhaled a melancholy sigh. "Well, you see, kid, you know why I live alone?" he asked. I shook my head. "Well, I had family too once. Marjorie. And my son, James." A sad look crossed his face. "You remind me of him. We had a dog too. A beautiful pointer. Named Max. James loved him. So, he was all torn up when he went running away. But one day, about a year later, we find him standing at the front door. Something's wrong in those woods. It changed Max. He wouldn't eat the dog food we got him. Only raw meat. James was happy to see him, but Marge was happier. I found it strange because the night I'd brought Max home from the pound, she yelled at me like she never had before. Benny chuckled wistfully to himself. "Well, since I was busy patrolling all day and night, I didn't notice it as much as I should have." James kept missing school, and I noticed he was thinner. I told Marge that she had to take care of her son, but all she did all day was spend time with the dog. I tried to do the best I could, but I was a terrible dad and a terrible husband. I should have helped my wife. I should have protected James. He exhaled. "I'm sorry," I said quietly, not knowing what else to say. Benny shook his head. "I ain't finished yet. You see, one day me and my partner get a call. Some neighbors had called about a disturbance at my address. My partner was in the driver's seat, and I was the first one to get out of the car. When I walked in the house, I saw my boy in the middle of the kitchen, dead. The dog was eating him. Instinctively, I shot the dog. That's when Marge turned around with a knife. She lunged at me, and I shot the fatal blow. All 3 members of my family, dead in one night. My mouth was wide, and the full weight of his words weighed heavy on me. Was that to be the future of my family? "Benny, that's terrible. I'm so sorry." I looked up at him to see a single tear trickling down on his otherwise stony expression. "I failed James as a father. I can't do the same with you, kiddo." After his story was finished, I felt my eyelids start to droop. I leaned on Benny's arm. "Good night, Benny." He was staring straight ahead, face emotionless. "Good night." When I woke up, the first thing I noticed was how much my back hurt from sleeping on a chair all night. But I wasn't cold. Benny had put his tattered flannel jacket over me as a blanket. I sprung up from my chair and yelped at the receptionist. "Where's Benny?" She jumped in shock. "You want to go do some errands?" He said. She got up from her chair and picked up a few items. "Take this, dearie. You must be starving to." She placed a buttered bagel, a blueberry muffin, a banana, and a bottle of apple juice on the table next to me. She was right, I was starving. Food always tastes the best after you've been deprived of it. I ran my fingers over my ribs. I could feel each one protruding from my chest. This was the first time I'd been full in ages. The receptionist had informed me that Princess had made it and that she was in the recovery stage. When I saw her for the first time, my heart exploded out of love for Princess, and I hugged her gently. I smiled as she licked my face. I didn't know where else to go, so I played Scrabble with the receptionist for the rest of the day. I got to meet a fat cat named Mr. Cuddles, a rabbit named Twix, and I got to eat a hamburger for lunch. But all throughout the day, I kept wondering, when would Benny be back? At 3:04 p.m., my question was answered as Benny stumbled through the door. There was blood on his clothes. A couple of police cars were waiting outside. "Let's get going, kid." Although I didn't get the full story immediately, I came to know the full extent of what had happened eventually. Even though he wasn't part of the police force anymore, Benny still had connections with the department and to the people that know what happened to his family. He gathered police officers and went to my house, where they found Duke eating the carcasses of my parents. Benny shot him dead. I wept profusely for my parents, not for how they were to me in their final weeks, but for the people they once were. Benny assured me that they had loved me. There were not many people at the funeral, mostly townsfolk. Seeing as I didn't have any other relatives, the courts placed me in the custody of Benny after a lengthy court process. A few years later, he officially adopted me. Princess came to live with us too. Benny was proud of me when I went off to police college, when I got married, when my wife and I had a child. As per his wishes, we held him a small funeral. Life is generally good to me. I have a wonderful wife and an amazing daughter. Sometimes on the bad days in the dead of night, I thrash in my sleep as visions of dead dogs and screaming people writhe in my nightmares. But when I wake, I look at my daughter sleeping in her cradle, and my wife hugs me back to sleep. I remember that everything is okay now. Third story. Mechanical sounds in deep woods, no machinery around. Disclaimer: if anyone has any links or knowledge about this topic, please send them to me. Trying to figure out what happened. 2020, summer. About 10 a.m., upstate New York in mountains. Was walking in the woods on a mountain near me. There is about 2 to 3 acres of trails to walk open to the public through a land trust, but if you break off it a bit, you can get to this old stone road. Not supposed to, but again, deep woods. Who's going to stop me? The old road is either an old mining road or an old railroad that was ripped up, no tracks, but quite a few iron spikes. I had cleared the land trust trails that you were allowed to walk on, skipped through some highly dense woods to get to the sandy-type stone road. Sometimes you see others on this trail, joggers/ATVs. I'd say of the 50 or so trips I took out there, I've seen people on that road 3 times. Once a group of joggers like myself, twice ATVs. When I entered the trail, nothing seemed off. I began walking down the trail. The stone trail, not the public one. Everything seemed fine. It was just a bit more noisy than usual, but a noise I've never heard before. It was a noise I can't actually describe that well. The best description I can come up with is that it sounded like a machine mimicking an animal, but not just one animal, like it was trying to mimic a bunch all at once. It was mimicking the bees, the birds, everything, but very poorly. You couldn't listen to one sound and say, this is that animal. It was as if it was all sounds all at once, but a mimic of those sounds. There was an aspect to the sound that just wasn't right. It's so hard to explain, but do you remember those videos with AI voices that flooded YouTube? They don't sound human, but they're definitely speaking English. That's what these sounds were. They clearly weren't the actual animal, but were speaking like them. At first, it was at the decibel of a slightly talkative restaurant. Not so loud that you really notice. In fact, I didn't really notice at first. Then it started getting louder. About 100 to 300 meters down the road is when I first truly noticed it and got goosebumps. But I'm a dude and I'm not superstitious, so I kept going. A really dumb dude, because I didn't bring any mace or weapon, and that area has both bears and mountain lions. It began to get louder. It went from the sound level of people talking quietly in a restaurant to a noisy, busy restaurant, but making those mechanical animal sounds, not people speaking. At this point, I actually stop walking and look around. The hairs all over my body stand up. You know the feeling, the one that's way past goosebumps. The feeling you get as a child when you just know there is something you can't see in the closet. The kind that makes you want to cover your head with a blanket and tuck your feet so the monsters can't grab them. Well, because it was a feeling I got as a child, I said to myself, "You're being paranoid," but I stopped and turned around to make sure nobody was behind me. I see something black and fuzzy about 20 feet behind me laying in the grass. It was a baby cat, probably bobcat, but can't be sure. Got close enough to see it was a kitten before it ran off. I see it, acknowledge it, and then turn back around and keep heading deeper into the woods. Now though, every single step I take, the sound is getting louder, and not only that, but now it's as if it's all around me. I got an intense feeling of being watched. Not by a baby bobcat. No, this felt like I was being hunted. Like something was watching me with evil eyes. This is going to sound absolutely insane, but I kept getting this image of a Native American man flashing in my mind. I kept looking into the woods expecting to see him watching me. Not as they exist now, no. The flash in my mind was as if it was one from a very long time ago. You know, now that I actually think about it, and I've only just put two and two together, there is some sort of memorial up there for a group of Indians, but it's all the way back on the area you're allowed to walk. The land trust section. Not where I was. Anyway, I got the feeling this Indian was watching me. He wasn't mad at me. He wasn't happy with me. He wasn't feeling any type of way about me. I kept getting the feeling that he was watching me intently. Despite this, I kept going. I said to myself, "You're being crazy. There is nobody there." Very shortly after this, like maybe 10 more steps, and I couldn't go on, I had to turn back. My entire body was shaking, and I was scared in the way a man gets scared. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I just said, "Okay, I'm leaving." The sounds persisted the entire way back, but on the way back, I see a branch 5 to 6 feet long laying across the road I just came from. This branch wasn't there when I first went down the trail. I second-guessed myself. Did I miss my exit back to the land trust and travel too far in the other direction? No, can't be. I know exactly where I am on this road, and I'm not at my exit yet. I go up to the branch while looking around. At this point, I'm convinced someone has been watching me and following me. I get to the branch, and right next to it is a giant paw print. Not bear, not dog. I'm fairly certain it was an adult bobcat paw print, which, considering I just saw a baby kitten, makes a lot of sense. I pick up the stick. It's now my only weapon until I get out of here. So I keep walking back towards where I need to be to exit this stone path and enter the woods to get back to the public trails. I get there, and the entire time I still feel like I'm being watched. I still feel this Indian present watching me. In my head, he was all black, but I knew he was an Indian because of his headdress. Again, this was flashing in my head over and over. As soon as I step into the woods a few feet, the mechanical sounds stop, and I go back to only having goosebumps. As I'm walking through the woods, though, something drops right next to me, loudly, and at the same time something swoops past my head. It was an owl. It tried dropping something near me. I have no idea what was dropped. It then went and sat on a tree branch and just stared at me. I got out of there and haven't been back since. Of note, there is no cell service out there. I don't think it's relevant, but it should be noted probably. I have no idea at all what the sound was, No idea why I felt so creeped out, nor why I was getting flashes of an Indian man in my mind's eye as the sounds got louder and began to surround me. The owl at 10 a.m. is a mystery. No idea why an owl is awake at that time. I thought they were nocturnal, and I have no idea why it tried to drop something on me exactly at the moment the sound stopped as I entered the woods again off the old dirt and stone road. The Indian, the owl, the bobcat. None of these things made me think I should turn around. It was that sound that did it. It hit me in an instinctual place. I felt like I was being watched and in danger. Almost like this thing was closing in on me. I don't advise anyone to go looking, but not because of this experience. There's a very bad dude that lives nearby. He's caretaker to the land trust, and he tried luring me into his home one day. That's a completely different story, but that's why I'm not giving the location. Dude was a serial killer, and he even had that charm, where you know it's a bad idea, but everything in my brain said, oh yeah, perfectly reasonable to go with this man into his home that I don't know. What really gave away this guy's intention was when the original lure didn't work, and I began looking around his property behind him at all the cars with different license plates. He tried using a different lure to get me inside. When I didn't respond, he got this confused look in his eyes and began trying even harder. His issue is that I'm antisocial and on the spectrum, and had read about psychopaths and their charm. The second I felt like it was a good idea, like a fly to a light, I snapped out of it because I recognized what it was. I don't have proof that he was going to do it, but the circumstantial evidence is there. So even if you do perchance discover the land trust I'm discussing, at the very least, stay away from the old man in the home to the left. If you are at the right land trust, you'll know which. The home that has a bunch of cars under a group of trees with the license plates still on them from different states, and art in the yard. To the left of the entrance at the end of the road you take to get to the land trust. All of the above is true. If you want to dismiss it, fine, but actually what I'm really looking for is answers about that mechanical animal sound. I don't think the rest matters unless one of you goes out there. And in that case, I'm being sincere with you. Stay away from the old man. Unless he's dead, then you're good to go. Fourth story. I think I encountered a Wendigo. My wife and I have been running the rat race for years with a family, a house in the city, 2 dogs, a cat, the stereotypical American dream. But the city took its toll, the neighborhood got worse, the crime rose, and we found ourselves looking for a way out. Our opportunity came when I was offered a new job out of state. It was a great career move, but we didn't want to move to a new city just to have the same problems again. So we started looking around and found a great mountain community about an hour and a half from the job and a great ranch-style house with a big back porch, windows everywhere, and a lot of property. The backyard has a big grassy area and a creek that cuts the property in half, then acres of woods beyond. It's huge. The house is more than twice the size of our house in the city. It's all updated and has no neighbors within a mile. It's a radical change from the life we lived in the city, but best of all, it was less than half of what we were paying for our old house. The house was a foreclosure, and when we asked the listing agent about it, she simply said the old family had abandoned the property. We really didn't think anything of it. The first 3 months were uneventful, with us settling into our new life, the kids getting used to the new school and new friends, and most of all, us getting used to the big house and property. But then the weather turned cold, and things started to get weird on the property. It started with noises from the back property, things we chalked up to being in the woods. Then the motion lights around the house started going off randomly. Once again, we just chalked it up to being in the woods. But last night, it all changed. Last night was the most terrifying night of my life. One of the dogs was at the back door whining and scratching. I assumed he needed to go to the bathroom, so I grabbed my flashlight and walked out the back door. Instantly, something fell off. The dog bolted for the back property, growling and snarling. It was a cold night, about 30 degrees, but the dog plunged straight into the creek and out the other bank, running off into the woods in the back of the property. Flashlight bouncing, I ran after him, calling his name. I got to the creek and made my way across the makeshift bridge, trying desperately to follow him. I could hear the dog still growling and barking from somewhere up ahead, and I pushed further away from the safety of the house and deeper into the woods. That's when I heard it, a shriek like I've never heard before in my life. It was a mix of a moaning wail and metal on metal. It echoed through the trees and froze me in my tracks. My dog bounded its way back to me and cowered down behind me. I turned around and could just make out the warm glow of the house behind me and the cold dark ahead of me. I swung my flashlight around wildly, looking for the source of the noise. And that's when I heard an even more terrifying noise. Out of the cold silence, my wife's voice floated all around me. "Babe," the voice called out. I whipped back around and could just barely make out the image of my wife, safely inside our house. The voice called out again. "Babe, I'm right here," came the voice from deeper into the woods. Then came another voice, just as clear as the other. It was my dad's voice. "Come out here," it called. I swung the flashlight around again, and this time caught the briefest glint of light bouncing off of eyes. The creature was in my beam of light for barely a second, but it was tall, maybe 6 feet, and ashen white. It had long, spindly fingers that grasped the trunk of a pine tree, and then it was gone. I turned back and ran towards the house. I ran headlong into the icy creek and stumbled. My dog ran past me, making it back to the yard and up to the porch. I dug my hands into the freezing, muddy bank and pulled myself out, not stopping to look back. When I reached the porch, I scrambled inside. My wife ran over to me, asking what had happened. I just shook my head. I'm not certain myself what happened. I had a growing sense of dread tonight as the sun began to fall. We kept the dogs inside, and I haven't dared to look out the back. But as I sit here typing, one by one, my motion lights in the backyard keep going on. 5th story. I found a body in the woods. I shouldn't have brought it home. It was the last day of fall, the very last brown leaves rattling on the oaks lining the back hill. I'd been out fixing a spot where the fire road had started to fall away. The property is 60 acres, most of it wild and crowded with ticks and poison oak. Even though I've lived here 20 years, there are places I've never walked. When I bought the land, I heard there was a spring somewhere up the mountain where the deer gather, but I've never seen it. As you might guess, I lived way the hell out of town, past the point where even the main roads turn to gravel, and then to dirt. Never once have I seen another person here, unless I invited them, and I didn't hand out too many invitations. I was just finishing up work when I spotted something strange in the nearby brush. A flash of orange. At first, I thought it might be a fallen leaf, still holding on to its last bits of color. But as I looked closer, I saw it was bigger, a hunting vest. I called out a hello and got no response. I cursed and spat, wishing I'd brought my shotgun. It wouldn't have been impossible for some lost hiker on the PCT to end up here, or some drifter wandering for miles out of town. I called out again and was met with silence. The cold wind rattled the leaves. I could tell snow was on the way. I could have left it there, of course, but it was my land after all. Slowly, I approached the orange thing. Then, as I reached it, I almost gagged. What I found was a body, fully intact except for the head, which was missing. There was no pool of blood, though. Stupidly, I bent closer and saw something that made me gag. Where there should have been a bloody stump, I instead found smooth skin covering the entirety of the severed neck. It was as if the body had been born headless with clean, unscarred skin covering the top of the neck where the head would normally go. The first snowflakes of winter began to fall against my back as I tried to figure out what to make of this impossible corpse. I had no way of knowing how long it had been there. It seemed fresh, maybe due to the cold weather. The hands were cool to the touch, pale and drained of blood, but they didn't show any signs of rot. Oddly, though, when I rolled up the sleeve, the skin looked slightly darker than the hand, almost like they belonged to two different people. I turned the boldly slightly to look at the other arm. It was yet another color, none of it matching. I told myself maybe it was a weird tan. Maybe he'd been wearing gloves at some point or a one-sleeve shirt. Maybe he'd had some kind of illness. I could have left the body there, but that would likely mean leaving it for the duration of the winter, 3 or 4 months under a few feet of snow. And who knows what condition it would be in when that time was over. I probably should have called the county sheriff, but there were a few plants on my land I didn't want him to see, not to mention some code violations. Finally, I decided that I'd be best off bringing the thing back to the house and disposing of it later, probably dumping it in a park somewhere so that it could be discovered by somebody else. With some effort, I hauled the body over to a cart I'd hooked onto my four-wheeler. Then I hauled us back to the main house before the snow started to stick. I had an uninsulated basement attached to the house, only accessible by a single staircase through the kitchen. It mostly kept the pests out and was good for storing some tools and a few dry goods. I dragged the body into there for the night, where it could stay cold but would be protected from the elements, not to mention the bears. Then I washed up and heated up a can of red beans on my cook stove before settling in to watch the news. The sick thought occurred to me that this was my first time having company in a few years. Maybe an hour passed and I got to drinking. Then, as I was heading to the kitchen for another beer, I thought I heard something. A little thump, followed by a kind of dragging sound. Of course, being out in the woods, animals were jumping on the roof all the time, but this sound had come from below. And if I'm being honest, seeing the body had set me a little on edge, even if I didn't want to admit it. I picked up my shotgun and walked slowly to the basement door, trying not to make a sound. I was trying to breathe slow, like in those yoga videos they advertise on the Home Shopping Network. Peering down the stairs, I could barely see the body's 2 feet near the bottom of the stairs. Except that I could have sworn I left the body clear down at the other side of the room. "Hello!" I called down into the darkness. "Hello!" There was no response, of course, so I shut the door and started back toward the living room. Outside, the snow was falling harder now, piling up on the dirt road. By morning, I'd be here for the duration, on my own until the March thaw. The sun began to slip over the far mountains, throwing a shadow over everything, almost like night. Before I could sit back down again, I heard another thump, and then another. I walked back to the door, but something in me refused to open it this time. Instead, I locked it. As I did, I heard a few more thumps, each one growing closer. And then the handle began to rattle. I took a step back, and then another as the rattling began to grow more urgent. "Go away!" I shouted. "Get!" But whatever it was didn't listen. Loud kicks began to sound from the bottom of the door, where the wood was beginning to buckle and splinter. I leveled my gun at the door and fired. Then I heard several thumps as something fell down the stairs. For a moment, I just stood there. I definitely wasn't doing any yoga breathing now. My heart was going so fast that it sent a tingle down my left arm. For a moment, everything was silent. My ears rang from the shotgun blast, and the air reeked of gunpowder. Then, I began to hear the thumps again. First one, then another as the thing made its way back up the stairs. Part of me wanted to shoot it again, to stand my ground, to defend my castle. But then I thought better of the idea. If one shotgun blast through the door didn't finish the thing, I figured a second shot wasn't going to do much better. So for the first time in my life, I ran. I sprinted to the four-wheeler and unhitched the cart. As I did, I looked up into the house where I saw the thing standing there. As I watched, it walked across the living room and sat down in the chair I'd occupied just a few minutes earlier. If it had eyes, I suppose it would have watched TV. I drove through the storm. There were a few hairy moments, but for the most part, one didn't hit much trouble. The whole time, though, I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. As if the thing were sprinting after me, running blindly through the snow, like it would catch me any second. Finally, when I hit the main road, I felt like I could breathe again. I didn't stop driving until I was all the way downtown. I'm not sure why, but the first thing I did was to walk into the most crowded bar I could find and order a beer. It's funny, it had been maybe 6 months since the last time I talked to anyone, but suddenly it was all I wanted to do. And for the next few hours, I flapped my gums at anyone who would listen, telling every story I knew. Every one except the one I'm telling you now. I never did go back to the property. I sold it to some rich man from California. I heard he demolished my old cabin, put in some kind of metal and glass fortress. Maybe that'll keep him safe. As for me, I don't ever plan on living out there again, especially after what happened to my neighbor Kevin. See, a few nights after I left, the sheriff got a frantic call from Kevin's wife, who had been out of town. She'd just gotten back to her house during a break in the weather. When she did, she found her husband's body, except it was missing a head. According to the coroner, it had been ripped off its body. Of course, they said it was a bear. But what kind of bear just takes a head and leaves the rest of the kill untouched? Uneaten? I've got no idea what the thing wanted with a severed head. Maybe it was just jealous. Maybe it wanted to wear it like a hat. And then I remember the way those skin tones didn't match on the arms and hands. I wonder, maybe if the thing started as nothing at all. If it slowly put itself together out of all the lonely old men in the woods. All the guys like me that thought we didn't need anyone. At night, I imagine a lot of things. I imagine my own neck ripping at the seams. And then I have to force myself out of bed. I sprint out into the street, running and running until I see another human being. Desperate to talk to anyone, willing to do anything for a little company. Anything to not be alone.